Quo. My name is Melvin, Wonpat, Borja. This show is brought to you by the Commission on Decolonization and our friends over at Glimpses. You're listening to Wave 105.1 FM, and we are live in the studio with another round of some political status conversation, Guam's decolonization, and all that good stuff. We're happy to be back here with you again on a nice Monday morning. Weather's been great today. Hopefully you got a chance to hit the beach over the weekend. It was really great beach weather. But there's been a lot of really interesting things going on in the news lately. I think a lot of it is very relevant to Guam's political status discussions. You probably heard over the news yesterday that the United States president authorized the bombing of nuclear enrichment sites in Iran. There's already cries from a lot of congressional delegates and U.S. senators claiming that the action was unconstitutional, and that this is usually when there is a call to action in violent conflict. There's a congressional approval, and so there's a lot of debate going on internally in the United States about whether or not this was an intelligent move, what would be the implications for it. Everyone, I think, is anticipating what Iran's response will be. Of course, the immediate concern is that there are 40,000 U.S. service members in the region around Iran. And of course, because Guam serves at a higher rate per capita than most places in the United States, there are a lot of people from Guam who are in these very unstable areas right now. And so our prayers go out to the families who have a service member in the Middle East right now. It's a very difficult, very challenging situation. I think it's easy to kind of get caught up in the politics of it and kind of forget that there are they're human beings whose lives are at stake right now. And, we understand that, when service members enlist, this is kind of what you sign up for. But nonetheless, I think that the calls for peace are critical. I'm really happy to see that the Guam's administration, governor and lieutenant governor, along with even the archbishop, have made these public calls for peace and diplomacy. And I think it's appropriate, especially because Chamorros not only enlist but also fight and die at a higher rate per capita in American conflicts than anywhere else in the world. And so, it's something that I think we feel very immediately. The legacy of war on Guam is not a pretty one. And we have a range of experiences in terms of the impacts of war. The most obvious, of course, is the violent occupation of Guam during World War II. But even after that conflict, the Chamorros were drafted into war immediately after becoming citizens, primarily into the Korean War and even into the Vietnam War. There's so many Chamorros who are veterans of both, either the Korean War or the Vietnam War. And there's a clear disparity in the way that Chamorro veterans who live on Guam are able to receive their benefits from their rightfully earned benefits. So it's a very complex issue, and it's still very kind of early on in the game. We don't know what's going to happen and how it's going to impact us. If you watch the report, there was the Secretary of Defense did a press conference with one of the lead generals, and they talked about this kind of deception tactic that they ran. I'm sure all of you heard about the news that they were transporting B-2 bombers, which is the only aircraft that's capable of carrying this particular weapon. They call it like a bunker buster, breaker, something like that. But basically, it's a new technology that has never been used in combat until yesterday. And what it is it's a satellite guided missile that drops a bomb at high velocity to be able to penetrate underground before detonating. and that was part of the the strategy, because the facilities in Iran are said to be underground and impenetrable. But there was news that they were transporting these B-2 bombers from Missouri to Guam, and there's this question, are they deploying these B-2 bombers to Iran from Guam? We found out later yesterday that it was actually a deception tactic. Like, they flew half the fleet to Guam into the Pacific as a distraction, or as a guise, and then they flew the other set to attack Iran directly. And there's already been a lot of political implications. Like, there's been conversation about whether, if the conflict elevates, will they start deploying air support from Diego Garcia, which is under the control of the United Kingdom. And so, of course, in order for that to happen, Diego Garcia is about half the distance from Iran as Guam is. So it would make more logistical, strategic sense to utilize that area. But in order for that to happen, the UK has to sign off and give permission to the US to utilize their airfield, which of course then creates it implies their involvement in the conflict. And UK does not want to have any part of this conflict. So there's this, huge conundrum that other nations are facing. I think for me personally, this makes me nervous in the sense that this has all kind of the regular bells and whistles of a global conflict, right? You have two nations that are at odds with each other. You have other nations that start to get involved on one side or another. And then the next thing you know, nations are picking sides, and as the roster starts growing, the conflict, of course, grows. And I think that's the last thing that anybody wants to see. I mean, it's not rocket science, no pun intended, but war is not good for living things like people and plants and animals. So, I don't think anybody wants to see a global conflict. Guam, unfortunately, finds itself in the middle of a lot of these conflicts. We bear the burden. I think the sad part about all of this is that the people in the United States who make the decision on whether or not the United States is going to war, it's not their kids that get sent to the conflict. It's usually a lot of black and brown people that end up populating the front lines. And, this is just math. I mean, you do the numbers and you look at where, what is the front line made of? It's often made up of people coming from impoverished communities like ours. So, it's definitely a huge challenge, something to be aware of and to, follow closely as it develops. But I think I don't think I'm alone in saying that, it's important right now that we put our intentions towards peace and diplomacy. All of that said, I'm excited about today's show because I'm live in the studio with Mr. Robert Celestial. Those of you who don't know Mr. Celestial, he is the founder of the Pacific Association for Radiation Survivors, often referred to as PARS, which I have to say is a really cool name, especially now that PAR has become like the new Tomoto lingo. You ever notice that all the young boys, they all call each other PAR? It's short for party. And it's funny because these are young kids who clearly have no guy kids, but they're calling everybody PAR. I just try to have some fun with it instead of getting all bent out of shape about it. Anyhow, welcome, Mr. Celestial. Thank you for taking time to meet with us and to sit with us in studio and have this discussion.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mel. Thank you very much to the people of Guam. It's going to be interesting this morning because Guam wasn't included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act.
Yeah,
and if you want to just jump into it, or do you want to just take one step at a time?
Well, I think what's important for our listening audience is we give them a little bit of context. What is the Pacific Exposure Compensation Act, and what does it mean to us? So for those of you out there who have not been following this, let's start with PARS. PARS is a nonprofit organization which is lobbied for the inclusion and recognition of Guam as as designated downwinders area for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, otherwise known as RECA. And so RICA is a compensation act, a congressional act that is built to, it's technically called the compensation related to exposure to the radiation from atomic weapons testing and uranium mining by the Congressional Research Service, July 19, 2024. Now, the PARS organization has consistently advocated that downwinders on Guam are defined as those present from 1946 to 1962 and who have been diagnosed with one of the cancers which are associated with radiation exposure. And so the reason why we use that, or PARS has used that framework or that timeline, 1946 to 1962, is because that is precisely the window when there was nuclear testing happening in our region, primarily on the Bikini Atoll, which is a part of the Marshall Islands. And for those of you who are unaware, the cancer rates on Guam are astronomical. People on Guam struggle with higher cancer rates per capita that are extremely high, even in comparison to other places in the nation, other places who are included in the in RICA. Guam is said to, I think the last figure I saw was that like one in two people, half the people on Guam are diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives. And it's become just one of these things that we have just accepted as just, it's just what it is.
Well, I'd like to go even further, Mel, since you brought all this information up. We have to go back to when they declassified this in 1994 through the Human Radiation Experiments Advisory Committee. When they declassified it, nobody on Guam or anywhere knew that we were exposed to nuclear fallout.
Right.
When they detonated these bombs for 1946-62, it was kept secret.
Oh, absolutely.
Even when I found the chemical, biological, radiological officer, Lieutenant Bert Schreiber, he was on island in 1952, and his Geiger counters were going off the scale.
Right.
And so he wanted to, alert the people, but he was told to go back to his workplace, and not tell anybody. So he had this burden for many, many years. So when I met him in Texas, first of all, before I met him in Texas, I asked him if he could give us a sworn testimony. And his sworn testimony actually said that, yes, the people of Guam were exposed to high levels of radiation. So I took that information, got invited to present our case before the Board of Radiation Effects Research Committee from the National Academy of Science. So we have to go that far back, and why PARS was formed as a nonprofit organization. It was Dr. Perez, myself, and a whole bunch of cancer survivors that we met at the airport that formed this group. And we were concerned because the United States wasn't going to fess up to what had happened to the people of Guam. So when we brought this information to the National Academy of Science and then presented our case with the other states like Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and the Navajo Nation. So that was in 2004. So in 2005, they published this book, Mel, right here. I don't know if they can see it.
I can show it to the
the
viewing audience.
Yeah, so they published that book, and in there, on page 200, even 199, it actually concluded that, yes, Guam did receive measurable fallout from the nuclear testings in the Pacific, and that Guam should be included as downwinders.
Right.
So the residents of Guam during that time period were exposed to high levels of radiation, kept secret.
Right.
So you mentioned earlier that we have a high rate of cancer. Mm-hmm. We've had a high rate of cancer and other diseases. And so we went before Congress in 2018. But prior to 2018, our vice president, Tony Teichfeld, and myself, we flew out to Boise, Idaho, because they had a conference of downwinders. Mm-hmm. That's where we built a coalition of individuals, other downwinders from New Mexico, Idaho, Utah, Navajo Nation. So we've been lobbying Congress ever since. And I don't know how far you want to go back, but Senator Crapo invited us. We testified before the Senate. They found out that, Guam was exposed to high levels of radiation. And the reason, not only for the people of Guam, but just to let you know that in 1977 and 78, they sent 6,000 military personnel to the Inuitak Atoll to clean up, whatever call it ionizing radiation, either plutonium, tritium, cesium, strontium, these ionizing radiation. So they sent us out there. So I was one of those soldiers. So we all got sick. And so there are less than 300 of us alive today. So when people ask me, why do we push this issue? It's because I was compensated.
Right.
A lot of my comrades are dead. A lot of them have cancers today. And so they passed the PACT Act. They included the Inuitak cleanup.
Right.
So that's why we want this, because we deserve it. The people of Guam deserve. We're no different than, Idaho, Utah, New Mexico. We're no different. And so to run it all the way up to today, last year and a couple of years prior to that, Senator Hawley came into the picture because of the Oppenheimer video movie that he showed that Missouri was affected, Tennessee and Kentucky.
Right.
So all of our states were included. It passed the Senate twice, with Guam in it, with Idaho in it, and Colorado and every other state. So this go around, when they wanted to put it in a reconciliation bill, which is still active today, we were surprised that Idaho, Colorado, and Guam was not in the bill. And so we are wondering what caused that.
Right.
Why didn't they include us on this go around? So unknown to us, even today, with all the letters I've written, all the phone calls I made to all the downwinders in Navajo Nation, no one wants to fess up. No one wants to say, hey, this is why they took you guys out. And so now, if you heard in the news that our group and Senator Teresa Lai, we sat down with Congressman Moylan a couple of weeks ago and explained to them, said, look, if they don't include us this go-round in the Senate, then you need to include an amendment to include us into the House bill. Right? And so he said that when it comes to the House, he's going to do it. The problem there is, would the House accept it?
Right.
Would it go through the committee? Would it go through the floor? Would it even pass muster to get included?
Which committee does this go through in Congress?
This goes to the Judiciary Committee.
Okay.
Yeah. So it right now it's going through the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. So whenever, or it might not even go to a committee because it's coming back from the Senate.
Right. So it goes straight to the floor from the Senate.
Right.
Okay.
And so hopefully it gets passed. The people of Guam, for many, many, many years, we've been doing this for 24 years, Mel.
Right.
And I've lost a lot of our members.
I can imagine.
A lot. And we've gone to Washington 4 times, and we've testified. We even had a conference in 2023 with all the senators, Senator Hawley, Senator Crapo, Senator Lujan, and even Congressman Moylan. They were there. We spoke in front of the Capitol, and we tried to lobby the whole entire Congress to push RICA. And so even with that, I was surprised that we were left out. And even in our Zoom meetings, it was mentioned that we don't have representation in the Senate. I said, that doesn't make any sense because we were in the 2 bills that got passed.
Right.
If we don't have representation now, we have representation. So what was the reason that you guys took us out?
Right.
So that's the $1 trillion question.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're at today.
I mean, I definitely think it's a frustrating thing, especially to know that it had successfully survived the Senate.
Yes.
And suddenly it didn't. And it's especially troubling to me to know that this is going to go back down to the lower house in a place that we have no meaningful representation. I definitely think it's great that there's a commitment from our sitting congressman to advocate for it at the lower house level.
Right.
But when it all boils down, we're talking about a non-voting representative here, and it's no disrespect to the congressman, as an individual, but the reality is that the framework for Guam's participation in U.S. policy making is substantially inferior to other places in the United States, other members of the union, who have a guarantee of meaningful voting representation both in the lower house and the upper house. In the past, Guam, I think, has proven that Guam can be effective in congressional and even Senate action by identifying our allies. There have been successful moments in Guam's congressional history where our delegate has been able to rally support from other voting members of Congress, voting members in the Senate. But right now, it seems like that's precisely what Guam is lacking in this discussion.
Yes.
That there's clearly not enough voting representation that is willing to support Guam's inclusion in RICA. Now, I think if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
In the sense that I wanted to touch on what you opened with and talking about, when this was initiated in the beginning of the nuclear tests by the United States in Inuitak, in our region, in Micronesia. While this was happening, it was all, very confidential and very, extremely classified. Obviously, this was at the beginning of the United States developing and refining their nuclear program. In which has arguably created the United States global military position in the world. I think it's ironic that President Trump was, on the news yesterday talking about how this was a necessary military action because Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And I think it's also, we won't even get into the fact that all of the reports to the president have been saying that Iran is not quite at that stage where they're actually developing nuclear weapons. They're refining uranium. They have a nuclear refinement facility. And that's what was bombed yesterday, by the way. And so I think it's ironic, that the United States is taking this stance that, we cannot allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons because Iran will use these against somebody. And I think it's ironic that the United States, it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. You know what I mean? The United States has more nuclear weapons than any country in the world, and it's not even close.
Well, if you listen to the powerful media, and then they have an alternative media, with people with podcasts and different, right? The mainstream media will basically tell you half truths,
Right.
And the alternative media, basically are experts like retirees, colonels,
Right.
generals, explaining things, what they actually experience, in the Middle East.
Right.
And so what had happened is that for many, many, many years, they wanted to start up nuclear production there in the United States.
Right.
And then the people from like New Mexico and other states, fought against it. Said,
Right.
Where are you going to start up this new program?
Mm-hmm.
And so they'd had protests and said, hey, don't do it in my backyard.
Right.
And so now they're blaming that Iran had nuclear weapons or building nuclear weapons,
Right.
but they've always had nuclear power plants.
Right.
And so which is the truth?
Right.
And then some media say that the real reason is because of finance, because
Right.
of BRIC.
Right.
They had to do that because they were like a knight or a bishop within the chess play.
Right.
And so they needed to do that to attack Iran to stop certain issues that are happening that's going to hurt the United States and other countries.
Right.
Because, if you look at it that way, that was one of the main reasons that people were talking about in the alternative
Right.
media. And so you won't hear that in the main media. And so that's where sometimes you have to go get your information.
Right.
But for us here on Guam is that You know, when I heard this morning that there's no threat, we are a threat.
Right.
They have a Chinese bomb that says Guam bomb.
Right.
You know, and then we have what, nuclear weapons here. We have the submarines,
Right.
nuclear submarines. We have aircraft carriers coming in. We have B-1 bombers.
Right.
We have, you know, we are a threat to these countries.
Right.
You know, I mean, my goodness, have they completed the 360 Iron Dome here in Guam yet? No, they haven't. And then when you watch the news, I mean, I'm watching the news, the Iron Dome for Israel didn't work.
Right.
I mean, it worked partially,
Right.
but they're being clobbered over there.
Right.
I mean, so you're spending billions and billions of dollars to upgrade our island, our little island. We are the biggest target here in the Pacific Ocean. But you're not even taking care of the people that you harmed back in 1946
Right,
62,
right.
where our people have been dying. You're spending billions of dollars doing this, but then you can't even afford $4 million. That's
Right.
how much it's going to cost. You know, someone did the math, and the math is we only had 4,300 people here in Guam at that time.
Right.
So multiply that. So it basically comes out that that's what the United States will have to cough up for Guam
Right.
in this program, where from 1990 to today, they only dispensed $2.5 billion.
Right.
That's a lot of years for less money.
You're right.
So we're asking, you're only adding Utah, more counties in Utah.
Right.
You're adding Idaho and
Right.
Guam, and that's it.
Right.
And so 2.5 billion since 1990 to today. I mean, $4 million. That's pennies to the United States. But if you give us health care, which he didn't put in this bill,
Right.
you know, that's what we're fighting for is health care. Come
Right.
take care of the people that you harmed here in the
Right.
island, our people.
And it's proven. It's proven.
Yes.
This is not like this is not just speculation. And I think that that's the troubling thing is that even in the islands that they actually tested this in, you know, the people of the Marshall Islands waited a really long time for
Right.
the recognition of what was done to them. I mean, even while the nuclear testing was live, there's records of the Marshallese people, you know, going out and like playing in the nuclear ash, thinking
Yes.
that it was snow. And there's, I mean, it's undeniable. No, I remember in the beginning when this first started kind of coming out, you know, just reading all of the news and the records on this, you know, it was very hotly debated, you know, because there was this kind of stance of denial by the United States, like, oh, no, you know, it's not as bad as you think it is. And then, you know, next thing you know, we're seeing all of these people being born with birth defects or people suffering from, you know, health conditions that are clearly related to nuclear radiation
Exactly.
exposure. And so, you know, when these records were declassified and when RICA went live in Congress, it finally kind of crossed that threshold where there was no more debating whether this was legitimate or not.
Exactly.
The only debate then was who is covered by this and who's not, who qualifies and who doesn't. And I think that that's the troubling thing for me is that even in this climate today, you know, so many years passed that, and I think it's, you know, this is kind of, I can't help but be reminded of war claims in this. And I know it's a totally different subject, but in principle, the war claims journey was very similar. You know, people on Guam had been fighting for war claims for so many generations. The atrocities committed on the people of Guam as relatively innocent bystanders, right? We were really just here because we're a possession. I mean, the United States even had intelligence that the Japanese Imperial Army was invading. They evacuated every single U.S. citizen on Guam and kind of left us hanging. But yet we still, you know, we celebrate Liberation Day as, you know, as America coming back to save us, even though, you know, the records show that more Tsumotus died on Liberation Day from U.S. bombs than the amount of people that were killed by the Japanese during the occupation.
You know, Mel, I want to interject there. I was just reading the report from Captain McMillan. Captain McMillan was in charge back then of
Right.
Guam during that time. And he became a POW. And in his last report, he said that, yes, we evacuated the dependents and civilians in the summer of 1941. And we accomplished that in October of 1941.
Right.
And then we were attacked in December 10th.
Right.
So they left us.
Right.
They basically left us, and they knew what was going to happen.
They knew, for
and,
sure.
And so it really upsets me, you know, that they were liberated.
Right.
They were taken off our island and left us. And then when the bombs started falling here in the island, nobody knew where to go.
Right.
Nobody, I mean, where were they going to run to?
Right.
And my grandmother, my mom said my grandmother died the day after the attack.
Right.
And so, yes, and then we have this issue
Right.
of today. I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, are we going to have eyes and ears out there in each
Right.
exit port, watching which dependent is leaving?
Right.
I mean, is that one of the signs, one of the signals that, okay, something serious is coming?
Right.
So that's the things that we have to be aware of.
Right.
When you see the dependents are loading up and taking off,
Right.
and then we have to talk to our governor and say, hey,
Right.
have you guys, are you guys really up to par to let the people of Guam, be aware?
Right. Well, I mean, I just think it's troubling that, when you look at these issues, this is all about recognition and compensation, right? Trying to make a historical wrong right. Now, when I think about the war claims issue, the parallel that I see between this issue and war claims is that, war claims successfully happened. And arguably, you could debate successfully,
Right.
but it happened, right? There was finally recognition by Congress that the people of Guam were owed war claims. They were owed compensation. They made a commitment that they were going to do it. The thing that bothered me about it was, one, when it happened, so many of our war survivors had since passed. If you go to any of the war memorials, go out to a war memorial this year. Go to Menengan War Memorial, which is probably the biggest one. And you'll see the majority of the war survivors, they always come out to attend these. Go and look at the war survivors. Go out and Fangingi all of our war survivors and do a head count for yourself. And ask yourself, find out how many of these war survivors are left and how old were they? How old are they now?
Very few.
Most of the war survivors today are the nennies of the war. They were the ones who were born during the war or born shortly before the war. They were just little kids at the time. And the reason why I bring this up is because for me, war claims came a day late and $1 short. I thought it was extremely problematic that Congress finally ponied up to this thing, acknowledged the harm done to the people of Guam, agreed to compensate, but did it after so many of the qualified citizens had already passed. Those are the people who never really got closure. And then on top of it all, the process was very stringent, very inaccessible, to the point that so many people on Guam missed the window to apply. And that's the reason why government of Guam ponied up and decided we're going to pay out the remaining war claimants out of our own money. And we use Section 30 money, which is the money that is captured by U.S. income tax paid to soldiers who are residents of states but are stationed in Guam. So instead of sending those tax monies back to their home state, they stay in Guam, and we use those monies to fund vital programs and services for the people of Guam. And so I think it's problematic, that we ponied up and paid our own people so that they could have closure, because the process, the job was not done well by Congress. Now, when I look at this, when I look at RICA and I look at the impact, I mean, the prime time here is 1946 to 1962. And if you think about the people who were affected by nuclear fallout at that time, these are people who are,
Up in age.
Yeah, they're up in age.
All right.
How many of you mentioned that most of your comrades who were a part of, the cleanup effort
Right.
have since died?
5,000 some.
It's wild to think about the disparity of, you got compensated. How many of your, compatriots passed without ever receiving that kind of closure?
And thank God for the PACT Act, because
Right.
it did open it up for DIC, dependent indemnity
Right.
compensation.
Yes,
for
and
the
that
wives.
absolutely is important.
The
I mean,
wives.
at the very least, these families should be
But
recognized.
I want to share this also. When they were negotiating the war claims, I remember it was Senator McCain that wanted to pass it prior to that
Right.
decision to pay ourselves.
Uh-huh.
Right. I did mention to the Congresswoman that this program, RICA program, pays all the way down to the grandchildren.
Right.
You know, I mean, the way it works here is that if the individual had cancer, the spouse is qualified. The
Right.
spouse had passed away, then the
Then the
children.
children, right.
If the children had passed away, then
the
the grandchildren could
Right.
file for the compensation for their great for
Right.
their grandparents. So I explained and said, why don't you have that provision in the bill for that?
Right.
But it was never mentioned.
Right.
And so that would have been beneficial for the people of Guam if
Right,
they had added
absolutely.
that. And so I'm afraid now that they took Guam out and Colorado and
Right.
Idaho. It says that's the same provision for this bill that's going into the reconciliation bill.
Right.
It goes all the way to the grandchildren.
Right.
So what's going to happen if we don't make it in
Then
the house?
ones who are recognized won't have the compensation extended to those generations.
Yes, on this
Wow,
one.
that is I did not know that.
On this one.
Right.
It will. But what's going to happen if Guam's and Idaho is not included in this bill? Are they going to change it in the next bill
Right.
when we go before the National
Right,
Defense
right.
Authorization Act? I mean, we don't even know what the language is going to be on that
Right.
one. Because
And how much more difficult is navigating that when you don't have a voting representative in Congress or in the Senate? I want to. We still got a caller? Okay, there is a caller on the line that wants to ask a question. If you are interested in the discussion and you want to get involved, the number is 671-922-1051 or 1052. And you can call and get on the air and participate in this discussion with Mr. Robert Celestial. But we got Joe on the line who wants to ask a question. Hafaday, Joe, you're on the air with us. Hello?
Mr. Joe?
I thought I heard him.
Me too. I heard him for just
Maybe
a
we
sec.
lost him. All right, Joe, if you hung up or you lost the connection, call us back, and we'll be happy to get you on the air. Again, that number is 922-1051 or 1052. If you're on the 1051, that number is on WhatsApp, and you can text a question or a comment. If you're joining us on the live stream, you can comment on there. I'm trying to keep track and make sure that we address all the questions and comments that are coming in on Instagram and on YouTube. We lost him? All right, we lost him. Joe, call us back, and we'll get you back on the air. Anyhow, going back to this discussion, I wanted to just give the audience a little bit more background on what RECA is and how this all works. So to answer the what, RECA is a law that provides one-time benefit payments to persons who may have developed cancer or other specified diseases after being exposed to radiation from atomic weapons testing or uranium mining, milling, or transporting. And so, of course, that kind of explains for Mr. Celestial here, who was involved in the cleanup in Eniwetok, the exposure to those sites. Now, for a lot of people don't realize, in addition to the downwind exposure, right? Where obviously, if you take a look at a map, we are in the path of the continual trade winds that come through our region, carrying the radiation exposure from these islands in the Marshalls down into our region. So everyone who is downwind of the Marshall Islands in our region was affected. For the states that were included in this, have been traditionally included, it's primarily due to their location to a mining site or to a test site, or of course milling or transporting these materials. Now, the WHO is, or at least who administers the funding, is done. This is done through the Department of Justice.
Yes.
Funding was disseminated from 1990 to 2024, and it was approximately $2.6 billion to over 41,000 claimants. Now, this obviously is a challenge for Guam being excluded. The classification groups include on-site participants, who are described as individuals who participated on-site in the atmospheric test of an atomic weapon and developed one of the specific cancers. Those individuals' compensation goes up to $75,000. For downwinders, these are individuals who are present in one of the specified areas near the Nevada testing site during the period of atmospheric atomic weapons testing and developed one of the specified cancers. Their compensation is about $50,000. And then the last group is uranium miners, millers, or and or transporters. These are individuals who worked in mining, milling, or transportation of uranium between 1941 and 1971 and developed one of the specified cancers. Their compensation is $100,000. Now, when you think about the severity of this issue, it's clear, right? The record, the history, the science is all very clear that uranium, all of these chemicals that are used traditionally in nuclear testing, milling, mining are extremely toxic, and it's undeniable. I think that's one of the positives. I think today, having this discussion today is very different than what it was before these records were declassified. Before the records were declassified, it was kind of like smoking. You know what I mean? Like I remember watching the old legislature film or videos of the legislative session hall, and back in in the early days of the first, second, third Guam legislature, all the senators had ashtrays on their desks in the session hall. They all look so gangster, and they're smoking cigars and cigarettes while they're doing their business. And it's kind of like when you go into restaurants before, they used to ask you smoking, non-smoking, right? Before, it was kind of, we just didn't know enough about the impacts of secondhand smoke at the time. And so, people used to smoke around their kids. Some people, I'm sure, still do, unfortunately. But since then, the science has really come a long way. And so now everywhere in the world, or not everywhere in the world, but in most places, smoking is kind of frowned upon. And so, of course, people still have a right to, partake if they so choose, but we take measures to ensure the safety protection of those around them. And so, we eliminated smoking areas in public places. There's regulations now. You can't smoke within 20 feet of an entrance or a window or a vent. And, similarly, the science and information around the impacts of nuclear testing, mining, milling has come a long way. There's no longer a debate about whether or not these chemicals are dangerous, whether or not they have an impact. It is undeniable that they do. I think that it's sad that though there's this clear acknowledgement of the health impacts of exposure to radiation and these dangerous chemicals, that we are still debating whether or not Guam is in the the risk zone. And ultimately that's what it is, right? I mean, it's frustrating even that to know that there's been clear recognition historically that Guam obviously is affected. I mean, the Marshall Islands has their own mechanism that they use with the United States to deal with compensation and fallout. But that primarily is a byproduct of their political status, right? They have the ability to engage with the United States and negotiate a resolution in a very different way than we do. Now, we also have a very different mechanism than, say, Nevada, that, Utah, right, that is included in this. Can I ask, which state has the longest record of recognition and compensation?
Well, there's three.
RICA?
There's three. There's Utah, but you got to understand, it's not the whole entire state.
Right.
You have Utah, Nevada,
Nevada.
Nevada, Arizona.
Arizona.
Well, they had powerful senators back then. You had McCain, you had
Right.
the other ones. But for Guam, I really thought that we had a greater chance of getting recognition in Congress because we are U.S. citizens.
Right.
But for the other islands, they're independent nations. They
Right.
have to negotiate through the
Right.
Compact Impact.
Right.
But if anybody has questions, if you don't mind, I'd like
No,
to read
please.
out the qualified diseases.
Sure.
And they have amendments in this new bill that's being introduced. But right now it's leukemia, other than chronic lymphocytic leukemia. It's multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, primary cancers of the thyroid, male or female breast, esophagus, stomach, pharynx, small intestines, pancreas, bile ducts, the gallbladder, salivary gland, urinating bladder, the brain, colon cancer, ovary, liver, except cirrhosis or hepatitis B is indicated, and the lungs. So these are the qualified compensable diseases in the program today.
Sounds like all the usual suspects. You know, I guarantee you, there's people out there listening today who are, you know, we're marking off the ones that you listed off and like, yep, somebody in my family had that. Somebody in my family had that.
That's true.
And you know, these are very common. I feel like that people on Guam have just kind of accepted that that's just what it is. That's just what we go through. Everybody goes through this, but that's not the case.
That's not the case.
It is not the case. There are so many people all over the world who don't deal with these kinds of health risks as just a normal part of life. And there's nothing normal about this.
I have quite a few of my members that go get diagnosed in the States, and the doctors actually said they've been exposed to ionizing radiation.
Right.
Some of their diseases are rare.
Right.
They said, and they say, are you from Guam? So yeah, a lot of families, thousands of families here in Guam have been affected.
Right.
And so it's sometimes they don't even know that they feel they're the only ones, but
Right.
they're not.
They're
There's
not.
thousands.
Right.
And so that's why we're trying to get Guam identified in this program. So we were asking for health benefits.
Mm-hmm.
They gave the EEOIC, the Energy Employees Individual Occupational Compensation Program. They gave them those that worked in the plants,
Right, nuclear plants.
right, the energy employees. So they gave them health benefits, but for the downwinders they didn't. So
Right.
I was hoping they would include it in this bill. So there's still an opportunity to include health benefits because that's very important. I think the 50,000 was raised to 100,000 in this new bill.
Right.
And so, 100,000 to all these cancer survivors is
That's a game changer.
I mean, not only that, but it's not enough.
It's not enough. Absolutely. It's not even close.
Right.
But I mean, $100,000 in the pocket of a cancer patient
Right.
is significant. And, you know, when I think about you don't have to go far to kind of see the impact that we're experiencing and the kind of, you know, the kind of normalized presence of these issues in our community. You know, every weekend, every week, every day, you hear about somebody who's got, you know, we got a medical fundraiser going on.
Every week.
Yeah, come down to, you know, such and such restaurant or, you know, buy a bento, a lunch plate. You know, we're raising money to send my grandma, my auntie, my mom, my sister to California or to Hawaii or to the Philippines for cancer treatment.
Right.
And, you know, and I think that one part of the tragedy is obviously that they're so prevalent, these issues and these health concerns. And it's so commonplace that healthcare on Guam is just insufficient to tackle the kind of specialized care and the massive volume that we experience. And so people on Guam have just kind of accepted that if you have one of these, you know, rare diseases that we don't have specialized care for on Guam, you just have to go to the Philippines, you have to go to Hawaii, you have to go to California. And those are thank goodness the Philippines has really kind of stepped up their game and has become a legitimate option for treatment because it's just a lot more accessible and a lot more affordable to most residents on Guam. But, you know, embedded in all of this, of course, is, you know, our veterans who clearly qualify or have even been, you know, notified that yes, you have 100% coverage for healthcare, but we lack the facility on Guam. And so if you want to avail of these benefits, you got to leave. You got to move out of Guam. How many families on Guam have the resources to just up and move, let alone up and move and then turn around and pay your medical expenses? And, you know, usually it involves somebody in your family that needs to go there with you.
I have members in PARS that can't afford medication.
I bet.
And so what happens that since they can't afford medication,
Right.
they just die. You
So
know,
unfortunate.
it's unfortunate, but that's the truth.
Right.
And we have to share that. And that's why it's very important that our government, our governor, our
Right.
legislature, and our congressmen, and all the people of Guam. I mean, we've been doing this for we've been really, really at it. We've worked with all the different organizations in the states. We are the voice, but we need
Right.
the voices out there. All the families that have cancer, the cancer groups, we need them
Right.
now very much to voice their concerns,
Right.
not only PARs, but every family out there, you know what you're going through. We know what you're going through.
Right.
We need your voice. We need your voice to come out and say, hey, look, this is serious. They passed this bill. They put Guam in twice in the Senate, but all of a sudden they take us out. We don't know what happened in the backdoor deals.
Right.
I mean, that's what it was.
Well, you probably would have known if you had a voting member in Senate or Congress, because your
Right.
voting member would have been, at part of those conversations. If there was a backdoor deal, they'd at least know what it was.
There was a backdoor deal. and I
I'm
don't
sure
know
there
what
was.
And Mel, I just found out that the congressman's LG, the legislative director, dropped the ball. He wasn't communicating with the Senate.
That is terrible.
We were out there. I mean, how many times we worked with the Senate? We worked with Senator Hawley. He had our back, but
Right.
there was no communication on this issue.
Right.
So now, they have to wait till the bill comes to the House,
Right.
and so I'm just hoping and praying that they could actually get Colorado, Idaho, and
Right.
Guam into the House bill. So we need everybody in Guam to step up.
I agree. And I know I'm very, very aware that you are in the thick of this fight, and you also have to kind of wheel and deal and lobby and advocate as though you were our paid delegate or representative. And so you may not be in a position to name names and call people out, but I am, and I will do it for you. If anybody out there is listening from Congressman Moylan's office, y'all guys got to do better, man. You got to do better. I know you're a non-voting delegate office, but nonetheless, you're still closer than all of us. I think it's really important that, and I agree. I think it's not just this. To be fair, this doesn't just fall on the congressman's shoulders. It also falls on our legislature. It also falls on our administrative branch. I think everyone in Guam, all of our elected officials, need to be staunch advocates for this.
Yes.
And that's really the only way that it's going to happen. And I also agree with you that the outcry has to be initiated by the community. When the people are outraged about something,
Exactly.
elected officials have no choice but to listen,
Right.
because their survival depends on it.
Mel, it's not ironic, but it just came to my thought. When I go through Home Depot or certain places,
Right.
it amazes me that people I don't even know come up to me and say, "Hey, Mr. Celestial, where's my check?" And I said, "What check?" He said, "No, the program. Where's my check?" And I said, "Well, when Congress passes the bill."
Right.
But a lot of times it's like that when
Right.
out in public. People know about this stuff,
Right.
but they won't vocalize it.
Right,
And,
right.
and the only thing they know is that keep pushing. I could only push the wagon so far.
Yeah.
And
Right.
with our small little nonprofit organization, we're doing a great job. It's just that we need everyone on board this time. I mean, to really push our local leaders.
Right.
I give a lot of kudos to Senator Therese Terlai. She's been with us from the beginning, and she's written letters, even resolutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's stopping Speaker Bloss from writing a resolution to Congress right now saying,
Right.
hey, you need to do this. The
Right.
people of Guam deserve this. So they could do it today.
Right. Well, it's a worthy cause. If you're out there and you're one of those that likes to call your senator, we could use some phone calls advocating for a resolution to get this passed in Congress. I think it's important that we, as a community, we have to initiate the pressure on our elected officials. That's the job. When you sign your name up and you get elected, that's the deal.
And I want to thank the governor, too, because she brought the issue up,
Right.
with the governor's meeting in the States,
Right.
And so they can only do so much also.
Yep, I agree. It takes a village. In our case, it takes the island. We are up at the top of the hour. We need to take a quick commercial break. I want to thank Mr. Celestial for being here in the studio. He's going to stick around. We're going to talk a little bit more about this issue in the next hour. Really intent on unpacking this within the context of political self-determination. How does our status affect all of this? Could it change if we changed our status? I would argue it could. I think the question is, how does it change? So thanks for tuning in to Challenge the Status Quo. We'll be right back after this commercial break. You're tuned in to 105.1 FM. This is The Wave.
KGUM FM. Daddy No. The talk of Guam is Wave 105 FM.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by O'Reilly Auto Parts.
I'm Matt Piper. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Dorothy Shea, just defended U.S. actions on Iran at a meeting of the UN Security Council.
Madam President, the time finally came for the United States, in the defense of its ally and in the defense of our own citizens and interest, to act decisively.
The mission for the U.S. to bomb 3 nuclear sites in Iran, dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, included 7 B-2 bombers that flew from Missouri. It came after Iran and Israel fought for more than a week. The big question now, how will Iran respond? CBS's Holly Williams is in neighboring Iraq.
Now that Iran has been weakened by more than 9 days of war with Israel, what exactly kind of retaliation is it capable of? We don't know for sure, but we may find out.
Those U.S. bombers came from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, outside Kansas City. Our Ian Lee is there.
We don't know right now if these were the B-2 stealth bombers that were used in the attack on Iran. We know that some stealth bombers were flown west as a decoy, some deception by the military to throw people off the scent of where these bombers were going, what they were doing, when they would attack.
There are some protests today following the U.S. attack on Iran, calling for the U.S. to stay out of another war in the Middle East. This man in Boston.
Donald Trump's attack on Iran is unnecessary. It was unprovoked. It is illegal. That's right. And it is extremely dangerous.
And not all Republicans are on board with the mission. Congressman Thomas Massey on Face the Nation.
Does 3 bombings and we're done with Iran's nuclear ambitions? Is that the 2 weeks to slow the spread of 2025? What happens when Israel gets bombed again? Is Trump going to sit by and say, no, we're not going to further engage in this war?
A brutal heat wave is in the forecast across the eastern U.S., and it's expected to bring several days of record high temps. It'll be near 100 from Minneapolis to Detroit, Louisville to New York, where Eric Adams is mayor.
Heat is not only uncomfortable, but is the #1 cause of weather-related deaths in our city.
It is Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Whoever wins takes home the big trophy. Reporter Erica Herskowitz.
It'll be winner take all when the Thunder host the Pacers in Oklahoma City tonight with the best of 7 NBA Finals, even at 3 games apiece. Indiana, of course, forcing the decisive game with a convincing 17-point victory back on Thursday night. And now the series shifts to OKC for the first Game 7 of an NBA Finals since 2016.
This is CBS News.
Think O'Reilly Auto Parts for all your car care needs. Get the parts and service you need fast from the professional parts people at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Hey, it's Mike Rohn. If I have a choice, I like to do business with companies that actually stand for something. That's why I switched from Verizon to Pure Talk. No offense to Verizon, I'm sure they stand for something. I just don't know what it is. Pure Talk, on the other hand, is a veteran-owned company that supports our military in a big way, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I also appreciate unlimited talk and text and plenty of data for half the cost of the big guys. And I do like being on America's most dependable 5G network for just $20 a month. But what I really appreciate is no contract, no cancellation fees, and Pure Talk's commitment to handle all their customer service in this country. I saw it for myself. I went to Georgia, I got a tour of their headquarters, I met their CEO, and I talked to the same customer service folks that you'll talk to when you dial pound 250 and say keyword micro. Switch today and save 50% off your first month when you dial pound 250 and say keyword micro. Pure Talk, a wireless company that actually stands for something.
Happening tomorrow, something new at D.C.'s Reagan National Airport.
It's a model of the airport's Terminal 2 made entirely out of Legos. The 150,000-piece spectacle, weighing about 120 pounds, took Lego enthusiast Richard Paul's 9 months to build. It features an accurate floor design with domes, arrival, departure levels, and even a baggage claim. Travelers heading to the airport can see the recreation before going through security into the terminal. It's not the first airport Paul's has built out of Lego bricks. He did a model of Dulles International Airport that's been on display there since early last year. Stacey Lynn, CBS News, Washington.
How to Train Your Dragon is maintaining its top ranking in movie theaters. Studio estimates show neither newcomers, Pixar's Elio and the Zombies of 28 Years Later, could topple How to Train Your Dragon's $37 million in ticket sales, which is in its second weekend. Matt Piper, CBS News.
70% of teens say their parents support them going to trade school or getting an apprenticeship. Here's why. I'm Jeff Colvin of Fortune magazine with the Fortune Business Update. College doesn't carry the same return on investment it once did because the cost is high and the outcome is uncertain. At the same time, the economy is filled with jobs that don't require a 4-year degree, but do offer 6-figure salaries. For example, the median annual salary of a marketing manager is almost $160,000, a sales manager $138,000, an information security analyst $125,000. Such jobs require education beyond high school, but not 4 years of college. The trades workforce is aging and demand is high. Little wonder teens and their parents are looking closer at trade schools and apprenticeships. I'm Jeff Colvin.
The views and opinions expressed in this show are that of the show hosts, guests, and callers. They do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the staff and management of Wave 105 FM, Glimpses Media, or any of our partners. As we strive to provide quality, respectful, and engaging content, we welcome you to participate in the conversation. Thank you for tuning in to Wave 105 FM, the sound of Guam. Enjoy the show.
All right, Hafadan, welcome back. You're tuned in to Challenge the Status Quo on Wave 105.1 FM. My name is Melvin Wonpat Borja. If you're just tuning in, I represent the Commission on Decolonization. The show is brought to you by COD and our friends at Glimpses. We're here back again with another round of political status discussions. I'm here in the studio live with Mr. Robert Celestial, who is one of the probably the most well-known advocate locally on Guam. He's been fighting for nuclear or the radiation exposure compensation for the people of Guam for 24 years. 24 years. Bless your soul, Mr. Celestial, for doing this work for us.
Praise God. I tell you what, being an atomic veteran, they finally acknowledge us, the cleanup veterans. Right. They gave us a certificate and a medal 2 years ago.
Right.
Saying, okay, you guys deserve it. What are we going to do with that?
Yeah, what do I do with this paper and this medal?
Right,
Can I swap this medal for full coverage on my health care bills? Yeah. That would be great if the certificate was like a voucher. You bring your certificate in and you get full medical coverage at the facility of your choice. That then would be awesome. But we spent the last hour trying to put this into context, help people understand the history of exposure, radiation exposure for the people of Guam, and also the history of the advocacy around RECA. So if you're just tuning in with us, RECA is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And this is a congressional act that was built to compensate people who were exposed to either atomic radiation from atomic weapons testing or uranium mining. And this is all being done recognized by the Congressional Research Service and administered by the Department of Justice. Now, we have a local nonprofit called PARS, the Pacific Association for Radiation Survivors. This org has been doing this work, advocating for the recognition and compensation for people in Guam for the last 24 years. And unfortunately, in the most recent round of consideration in the U.S. Senate, Guam was excluded from RECA. And so now the bill is going back down to the lower house for a vote. And the effort currently is to get Guam recognized in the congressional discussion, so that when it elevates, Guam is included, and we have an opportunity for our people to receive that compensation. And this is I think there's some people out there who, when they hear compensation, they think, oh, you want another handout, but this is not a handout. This is something that has a lot of science, a lot of history and documentation to back it. It's undeniable, the impact of radiation on an individual's health at every level, whether you were somebody that was directly in contact for a cleanup or for the testing itself, if you were just happen to live in an area that's downwind, if you were involved in transporting uranium or milling or mining uranium, there are clear, undeniable health impacts. And so, it's not, the math is not that complicated on this one. I'm not that great at math, admittedly, but even this math is simple enough for me to see that, the people of Guam are clearly deserving. We are clearly impacted. There are a lot of people out there today who were not even alive during this nuclear testing that have, clearly been impacted by it. At the back end of our conversation in the last hour, Mr. Celestial mentioned that, some of his colleagues who have been getting regular treatment and testing in the States are often kind of easily identified by doctors because of the nature of the ailments that they face. And it's easy for doctors to recognize, oh, you must be from Guam, because we only see this in patients from Guam. And I think that should be enough, for people to understand the gravity of the situation, and to be able to recognize that this is a very troubling exclusion. For Guam to not be considered in RICA it's a major failure. It's a travesty of atomic proportion, no pun intended. And so, right now I wanted, of course, the conversation on this show is really always focused somehow on Guam's political status. We mentioned earlier that this bill is coming out of the Senate, going back down to the lower house for consideration, which, I think may give a lot of people some hope. We have representation in Congress that we don't have in the Senate. But, I think it's also important to point out that, we're really putting all of our eggs in a basket of a person that has no vote. And that's the nature of the delegate that represents Guam in the House of Congress, in the House of Representatives, is that, our delegate is a non-voting representative. Our delegate has a right to sit in committee. I believe can even chair a committee.
He can even vote in committee.
Right, can vote in committee, but cannot vote on the floor.
Right.
And, that relationship or that arrangement has proven that it can be successful in certain moments. We've seen other delegates who have successfully kind of built a strong network of voting allies that help to push Guam's issues forward. And for whatever reason, that has not happened on the RICA issue. And the RICA issue is not a new one. And so, I think it's fair to say that there's been multiple generations of effort to solve this thing. And it's unfortunate that we're still here today, just struggling to be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be treated with dignity.
Well, we've been recognized. It's to be included twice.
Right.
To be passed. The bill passed twice
Right.
in the Senate. We were recognized. We've been recognized nationally for so many years. It's just that, like I mentioned earlier, we didn't know what the back deal, was done.
Right.
And that they took Idaho, Colorado, and Guam out.
Right.
And then they said, okay, you guys go down to the House and let them fight it out down there.
Right.
But it's. If like you said earlier, if we had a different status, if we had a voting senator, if we had a voting congressman or woman, it would have been different, because then they had leverage. They'll have leverage to say, hey, and that's what's happening there in the Senate. They're saying, Senator Lee's saying something to Hawley from Missouri. At first we don't want. He didn't want to participate last year, and we needed him. And so now all of a sudden he changes his whole entire attitude. Now he's for it, but all of a sudden there's three of us out.
Right.
So how did that work?
Right.
Alaska, Tennessee, and Kentucky was never in the picture.
Right.
Then all of a sudden they're in the picture here. They came out of nowhere, and we're like, okay, so what exactly happened? But the main thing is that we're praying that we get it through the House.
Right.
And so here we are today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that just the acknowledgement that Guam lacks meaningful representation, voting representation, both in the lower house and the upper house, as well as electoral college votes that can influence presidential election. That gap in our meaningful representation and ultimately our participation in the U.S. system of democracy, I think, is very clear. And I think it's also very clear how that impacts our success rate when there are things that we need, acknowledged, recognized, considered by the powers that be in the United States system. But to be fair, there are others like the RMI who are not territories, right? They're not a territory. They're also not a state. But they clearly were. I mean, this is the island where they actually did the testing in. So the impact is undeniable on the people of the Marshall Islands. But the people of the Marshall Islands managed to negotiate their recognition and compensation with the United States just through a different mechanism.
Right.
As many of you know, the Republic of the Marshall Islands has a compact of free association with the United States. And so they have a very close relationship with the United States politically, but they are not a possession of the United States, not like Guam. So the primary difference between the Marshall Islands and Guam is that, Guam is an unincorporated territory, which essentially means that we're owned by the United States, but we're unincorporated, so we're not a part of the United States. We don't participate in their system of government, despite having an organized local government. The RMI also has an organized local government, but they operate under this exclusive arrangement in their compact with the United States. And so part of their compact agreement in the previous one included some of the compensation for the nuclear fallout, but so too does their renewed compact. So all of the freely associated nations, negotiated the terms of the next 20-year agreement. The Marshall Islands, I hear the Marshall Islands was even able to negotiate funding in order to build a nuclear museum in the Marshall Islands, which is a really exciting thing because part of the success of the Marshall Islands was being able to elevate their issue to a global stage. It's no secret anymore. It used to be a secret, as you kind of mentioned earlier, that, all of these testing efforts in the Pacific were highly classified. And it wasn't, until 24 years ago, right, that the records were finally released. And so I think it's a very interesting thing to analyze. We know we have a pretty good idea what it would look like with voting representation in the Senate, voting representation in Congress, maybe even voting representation in the Electoral College. That can only be accomplished if Guam was elevated from not unincorporated territory into a state status, right, becoming a member of the Union. But it also is very possible if Guam was able to elevate to a status of free association, in which case we would negotiate directly with the State Department and the U.S. government, right, not through the congressional or Senate mechanisms. The same could be said, though we don't have, I don't think we have any clear examples, at least within the United States, of an independent nation negotiating compensation with the United States for radiation fallout. But the principles are very similar, right? Because a freely associated nation essentially is an independent nation that has agreed to an exclusive relationship with a larger nation. And that's really what makes, the freely associated nations in Micronesia very unique. And we see, each one of them is different. A lot of people consider Palau to be an independent nation, but technically they are under a compact of free association, just like their neighbors in the FSM and the RMI. I think a lot of people view them as independent because that's the way that they behave. Even though they have this exclusive deal, Palau has this tradition of kind of pushing the envelope and really pushing the boundary to see, like, what else can we do? How else can we create relationships, partnerships with other nations? They kind of forge their path ahead and go all out until the United States says, whoa, time out. You can't do that. That's not cool with our compact. But, nonetheless, it doesn't stop any of these nations from creating partnerships with other nations outside of the United States, which I think is extremely beneficial to the people of Guam, the government of Guam. You know, what kind of leverage does Guam create by being able to identify other partners in the world? But, you know, right now, I think the path forward is clear for us as an unincorporated territory. We got to go out there and we got to lobby our butts off. You know, I just think it's a frustrating thing for me personally when I think about, you know, the way that you framed this in the beginning was that you know, a lot of this really kind of caught fire when you were recognized as an atomic veteran, right? And you mentioned in your explanation of your personal history that this was something that, you know, was clearly owed to you and your, you know, your counterparts, right?
My comrades.
Your comrades who also served and had this exposure like you did. You know, it's clear that you were deserving of this recognition and this compensation. And then you turned around and said, well, you know, the people of Guam were exposed also.
Right.
Clearly, they also deserve this kind of compensation and recognition. And I think that that's what really sticks out for me, you know, is that it's undeniable that the impact is being felt by the people of Guam, even if these people who are suffering from these ailments were not out there at the cleanup site with you.
Right.
You know, just the fact that they're downwind, the amount of nuclear exposure, radiation exposure, all the amount of testing that they did during this time in the Marshall Islands was, I mean, it was significant.
Right.
And so, you know, the exposure, of course, is going to also be significant. And I think it's just troubling, you know, to think that the science is so clear, the history is so clear, and the impact is so clear. But yet we're still over here with this mentality that, oh, we got to just get out there and lobby our butts off again. You know, it just bothers me that that's what we are reduced to as lobbying. You know, we got to go out there and pretty please our way all the way to victory. Just like we had to pretty please our way all the way to war claims and compensation for World War II. And I think that's my biggest fear right now is, you know, how much longer does it take for us to get this compensation, and how many of our people will die within that time? Just like war claims, you know, how many people did we lose along the way before we actually got the authorization to proceed on war claims?
And even with that, we didn't get exactly what we deserve.
Right. Our government ended up ponying up and paying the rest of the bill for Congress. Right. You know, which I always felt so conflicted when we were doing war claims. And it was extra personal for me because the governor made me the chairman of the War Claims Adjudication Committee. I really did not want that assignment. I was praying that I wouldn't get it. But, you know, the governor called on us, and I wasn't about to make my own personal hangups get in the way of justice for our people. And so, you know, I just kind of ponied up and handled the job. But it was a gut-wrenching experience for me. Now, I'll never forget, like, going through all of these applications, like stacks and stacks of applications from our people. And it was such a painful process. It was not just about reading these stories, but seeing these individuals have to relive these experiences just so that they could write it on their application in the hope that they can get some kind of compensation, some kind of closure for what had happened to them. I mean, it was just such a difficult task. And I imagine that this is very, very similar. You know, the kind of horror stories that our people can produce about the experiences that their families have gone through as a result of this radiation exposure, I'm sure are very, very troubling. And how many of those stories go untold? How many of these stories nobody will ever hear? You know, and those families will never get compensated. I think that that's just such a tragedy, and it's entirely avoidable. You know, I think that that's the thing that troubles me the most, is that the United States could have resolved this situation a long time ago if there was the political will to do so. But it's easy to kind of forget about, or even blatantly disregard people who are way out in the Pacific that nobody in the nation knows about. And a lot of people, I think, have that experience. You know, they go somewhere in the States and somebody asks them where they're from, and they're like, oh, I'm from Guam. They're like, oh, where is Guam? What is that? Not realizing that, you know, we were made U.S. citizens, and that a lot of our lived experience is a result of this inequitable relationship that we have with the United States. I just got word that we got the caller who was trying to get in earlier is back on the line. So we're going to go ahead and take this call. If you are interested in getting involved in the conversation, the number is 922-1051 or 1052. And you can call us at the station and get involved, or you can text the 1051 number if you have a question or a comment. All right. Hafaday Joe, you're on the air with us. Do you have a question or a comment?
Maybe a comment.
Oh, there you are. Hafaday Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Is Robert still there?
Yes, he is.
Buenas, Stella.
No, this is another problem, not only the World War II. The draft, 1967, the draft that we got drafted for Vietnam, although we got the compensation for those from Uncle Sam, but the thing is that bothers me because a lot of the Chamorro kids, the young kids of 17, got drafted, and also, national, worldwide, the national draftees also of Vietnam. And the thing is, we lost about 77 young guys from Guam, the Chamorros that were killed in Vietnam.
Right.
And it's very sad because although we got compensation, but the thing is that we got drafted for to go to war and for Vietnam. And at the time I was 19 years old when I received my draft, the A4, selective service, to go and get drafted for Vietnam. And there's a lot of us that left Guam, the Chamorro guys, I think it was 35 or 30 of us left Guam for basic training at Fort Worth, California. And we were very sad because I was the oldest, out of the 14 of us, among the oldest, and now I came in the first, and then my other two brothers also got drafted. The four of us, actually four, because one was stationed in Germany, and I was stationed at DMZ Korea, and my two brothers are stationed in Vietnam. Although one of my brothers received a Silver Star, and I believe there's only two of them from Guam, the Chamorro, the fought in Vietnam, received a Silver Star. The thing is that really, bothers me because when I was up at the DMZ, we had to do some night patrol and day patrol to assist the ROC Army and the ROC Marines, the Korean soldiers. And we had to clear the DMZ close to the no man's land and clear out the leftover from the Korean War, the minefield, and also the no man's land close to the DMZ, the North Korean. We had to parachute or live by the helicopter on the rope ladder, and the two of us will have to penetrate close to the no man's land. The thing is that really bothers me is that my late father was very disturbed because I was supposed to take and serve all my siblings, and he don't want me to go, join the army. But the thing is, if you receive your draft later, you have to receive it, otherwise Uncle Sam will put you in jail.
Right.
That's it.
Thank you, Joe, for your call. I appreciate your time and participating in the discussion. I think that this kind of goes back to our unincorporated territory status. We have this inferior political status, but that does not prevent us from kind of participating in the United States kind of system of operations, right? And including obviously the military. When our men and women enlist in the military, they sign up for that life. There's no asterisk that says like, oh, you're going to have a little bit different duties or expectations because you're from a territory. The expectation is the same for all soldiers. They go out and, as veterans say, they make the ultimate sacrifice. And obviously, men and women from Guam have done that on multiple occasions.
For all branches.
Yeah.
Army,
for all branches.
Marines,
yeah, absolutely.
Navy, Air Force,
yep. The Guard, the Coast Guard, all of it.
All of them, we do the same job. They tell us what to do, and we go and do it. We accomplish the mission. And so you're absolutely right. There's no distinction. There's no variation.
Yeah.
Where you put on the uniform, that's the color whoever we are.
Yeah. And I think that it's frustrating for me, like this situation that just started transpiring over the weekend with Iran. A lot of people are kind of on edge, trying to anticipate, what will be the Iran response, and what will then be, what will happen after that. Will this plunge us into a violent conflict? Already, there are a lot of us who are nervous and anxious about the safety of our families that are stationed in the Middle East right now, because obviously there's a higher risk for them in the region that they're at. And so, I think that that's the thing that bothers me the most, is that when our men and women are not naive, when they sign up and they enlist and they put that uniform on, they know what the risks are. And that's not I don't think that that's the question. I think the question is, why is it okay for our people to make these sacrifices with such little and unacceptable levels of participation in the government that ultimately will decide what we do or don't do, what our men and women are ordered to or not to do? When in order for war to be declared, right, Congress got to sign off, president got to declare war. We don't got to vote in either of those things. We don't have a say in either of those things. There's already a call from a number of congressional representatives and U.S. senators
that it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, that it was unconstitutional, that they didn't participate in a decision that ultimately led to this action. And, it's already frustrating for people who have voting representation. And what about us who have zero voting representation? I just think that in principle, it's just not right. It all, for me, boils down to fairness and justice.
My opinion is this, just get the ball rolling, find out exactly what needs to be done and do it.
I agree. And I think that that's a lot of people out there are, very, very educated and very tuned into this issue. It's a very important one for them. And I think a lot of us are just out here waiting, wondering, when are we going to actually vote? And I think that that's even for me, I'm like as close to this as you can possibly get. And even for me, it's frustrating, thinking about the challenges that we have faced at the judiciary level. The Davis decision that effectively kind of just pulled the emergency brake on our action and our efforts to, facilitate a referendum. And now, in order for the government to proceed with a referendum, we have to just open up the vote to every single registered voter on Guam. And, the principles of decolonization are pretty simple. The right to decolonize is the right of the colonized.
But to me, that's not self-determination, because other countries, like the Philippines, Japan, they voted on their decision, which direction they wanted to. They didn't ask, people of the United States or us, can we vote? They say, you can't vote because you're not part of it. Just like us.
The injustice was not inflicted upon you in the same way that it was upon us.
And then now you're saying you're opening it up to anyone, that's here can vote. you mentioned that even the military personnel
Oh yeah, any one of them could vote. It takes 30 days to register to
right.
vote on Guam.
And that doesn't make any sense
It
to
doesn't.
me, because I'm the one that's voting on my, I mean, as a Chamorro,
Right.
and saying, I want to go in this direction, but why do you have the right to determine my destiny when
Right.
you're not even part of me, and you already had a decision,
Right.
whatever country you're from?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, and that's the thing that, I mean, even for Dave Davis as an individual, yes, Dave Davis it's true. Dave Davis is also being discriminated against by being a resident of Guam, not having a voting representative in Congress, not having a vote in the Senate, not having a vote in the Electoral College. It is an injustice.
Right.
And he also experiences that discrimination by being a resident of Guam. But my thing is that there's a difference between Dave Davis and somebody like me. Dave Davis made a decision, an uninhibited decision. As an individual, he decided, I want to move to Guam. I want to live in Guam. And he moved from Arizona or wherever he came from. Wherever he came from in Arizona or whatever state, he was a full-fledged American, right? Like full citizenship, full representation, full participation in the U.S. system. And so Dave Davis coming to Guam, at any point he could just go back to where, matter of fact, I think he is back in Arizona somewhere getting medical treatment. This is not an option for people like us. Dave Davis came into the situation willingly where he's being discriminated against. But I didn't make a decision to be an unincorporated territory. We didn't vote on the Organic Act of Guam. Neither did my parents or my grandparents or my great-grandparents. It's just kind of an inherited situation that we had nothing to do with. But nonetheless, we feel the impacts. And so I agree. I think that, self-determination can be done as a nation, as a collective, or it can be done as an individual. And how many Chamorros have made that decision for themselves? There are currently more Chamorros living in the continental U.S. than there are in Guam.
Right.
And a lot of them are permanent residents of the states that they live in. And so those Chamorros are different than us in the sense that they do participate in the U.S. system of democracy.
As a resident?
As a resident.
And a U.S. citizen,
right.
They have the right to vote.
Right. And so their delegate in Congress who actually votes, they get to vote for that person. Mm-hmm. They vote for senators who have a voting representation in the Senate. They vote for their representatives who, or for their electoral college to choose their candidate of choice, which is a very different arrangement for us. And that's also reflected in the Guam law that was shot down in the Davis case. It's ironic, I think, that, Davis was crying, foul that we were discriminating against him because he's not Chamorro. And I always argued, shoot, our law also discriminates against other Chamorros. Because if you're a Chamorro, but you went and became a resident of California, you can't vote in our plebiscite anymore. Because now you're not a second-class U.S. citizen. You're like a real one. You know what I mean? You have all the bells and whistles that make it, freedom, liberty, and justice for all that we don't experience or enjoy here in Guam. Now, the other irony, I think, is that Dave Davis came out and said, oh, I'm not doing this for me. I'm over here trying to champion the rights of all of these disenfranchised Filipinos who are also being discriminated against in Guam, and they won't let them vote in the plebiscite.
Yeah, but they already have their own country.
Right. The Philippines also had an act of self-determination in which they chose to be independent.
You have independence
and
celebrate it.
On top of all of that, our law never defined eligibility based on race. It defined it based on time.
Right.
So if you were made a U.S. citizen by the Organic Act of Guam in 1950, then you qualify to vote in our plebiscite. That also includes a large number of Filipino people who came here for Camp Rojas to rebuild Guam after the war and stayed on as residents of Guam through 1950. And so there are a number of Filipino people. If you are a Filipino from Santa Rita, Agat area, you're more than likely qualified to vote in our plebiscite.
Sure.
Because that means that you were made a U.S. citizen by the Organic Act of Guam, which is an act of Congress and not an act of self-determination. So Congress made a decision for every single resident of Guam that included a healthy number of Filipino people, and we all became U.S. citizens together.
Japanese, they had
there were other ethnic groups for sure.
different ethnic groups here on Guam back then, even, prior to the war.
Right.
And so, yeah, it just behooves me that they haven't even started, with organizing the plebiscite.
Right.
I mean, if we had all the rules and the policies and who can vote and who cannot vote, I think we could just do it. There should be a timeline saying, okay, we're going to do it in this year and this month,
Right.
and just gather all the people, educate them. I think we could do it.
Well, the Davis decision was pretty clear in that if the government of Guam if the people of Guam wanted to have a referendum where we limit eligibility to qualified people, right? We say only these people can vote.
Okay.
Then the government cannot facilitate the vote. The government cannot spend public money to facilitate a referendum. If the government is going to pay to hold the vote, then it has to be open to every registered voter on Guam. Now, even the AG weighed in on this and confirmed that if a non-government organization, a nonprofit or a non-government org decides that they want to host a referendum and they're not using government monies, then they can limit eligibility all they want. They can do whatever they want, however they want. But the government just can't be involved. And so I would imagine that if an NGO steps up and says, we're going to hold the referendum on our own, I'm hoping that the Commission on Decolonization will still be in effect, because part of our mandate is to facilitate the referendum. Now that that's out, the only thing that we are legally allowed to do is to continue to educate our community and raise awareness. And so I'm hopeful that if it goes down like that, then COD will still educate.
I prefer that.
I would be happy with that, and I would happily educate and stay away from the organizing of the referendum in order to let it happen.
That way, it almost be like we're really going to determine our destiny.
Right.
I mean, and we won't have any outside influence.
Right.
If an NGO or a nonprofit organization was to do that, because then it would be people. The NGO would be actually people who are
in the community
exactly.
on the front line. Yeah, I agree.
Then they just make they'd follow the guidelines and be educated. Like you said, you're going to educate them,
right?
And tell them what rules and policies that they can follow or make up if it's possible,
right?
And say, hey, these are the ones who could vote. These are the ones who can't vote. These are the eligibility. Let's do it. And then have a sign up a registry, of all the people that's eligible, and then I believe that's a start.
I think so too, and a lot of that work has started already. Like when the Davis case went live, the court put a moratorium on GovGuam's ability to set a date for a referendum, and GovGuam developing or soliciting names for a decolonization registry, which we were already doing. There are over 11,000 people who are registered in the decolonization registry in order for us to kind of figure out how many people would be eligible for this vote.
All we need to do is transfer that information
right,
to the NGO.
Because that's all public information.
Right.
That's the beautiful thing.
So then you transfer that information to the NGOs or the nonprofit organization that decides to do this for the people of Guam, for themselves, because basically that's for who it is. And I think that's a win-win for everybody.
I agree. And so, just to kind of bring this back to Rika and kind of what we're going through now, I just wanted to share some information about the nuclear radiation and compensation efforts by the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So just a little backstory or information from June 30th, 1946 to August 18, 1958. The U.S. military conducted 67 atmospheric, atomic, and thermonuclear weapons tests over the Marshall Islands, atolls of Bikini and Eniwetok. The COFA, the Compact of Free Association, Section 177, the U.S., quote, accepted responsibility for compensation owing to the citizens of the Marshall Islands for loss of damage to property and person resulting from the nuclear testing program, end quote. Now, following that, the compact with RMI also established a $150 million nuclear claims fund. The purpose was to provide compensation for nuclear contamination related injuries and damages and the fund was meant to generate through returns on investments as a perpetual source of revenue for the 4 most affected atolls of RMI. I just want to repeat that real quick. The fund was meant to generate through returns on investments as a perpetual source of revenue. And so this was deliberately set up in an investment mechanism so that the pool of money never ran dry. The idea was, and we could argue how effective this was or wasn't, but I think the point is that because the RMI, as an independent, a sovereign nation, right? When they self-determined, they became a sovereign nation, and they agreed to enter into this exclusive deal with the United States. Before they agreed on it, that was their ask. They wanted to be compensated for the nuclear fallout and the impact on their people. They embedded it into their compact agreement, into their contract with the United States, and they wouldn't sign without it. Now, earlier, before we got on the show, Mr. Celestia and I were just talking in the hallway, and he had mentioned that there was there was a lot of politics at play, and at the time, China was heavily courting the RMI.
Well, this is, to my understanding, is that the first compact,
right, the very first one,
very first one, ran out. They ran out of money.
Right.
Right. So when the RMI went before Congress, but first they had to go to the Department of Interior, see if they could go to Congress because that's in their contract.
Right.
They were rejected.
Right.
They were rejected. They said, no, you don't have enough evidence.
Right.
Because on Section 177, it said that this is final.
Right.
I don't know if you don't have that part there where
I didn't.
Yeah. So he said this is final. Right. This is the agreement we're going to make. You can't come back to the Congress and ask for any more money.
Right.
Right. So what happened was that when I did a little bit of research, not that much, I read 177, but there's another section in their compact that says that they could go to Congress and have anything changed within the compact.
Right.
Right. So I don't know if they did that, because what had happened is that then China built a relationship with the RMI.
Right.
And when they were building the relationship with RMI, they promised them that they would do certain things for the RMI.
Right.
And so what happened is that when they were negotiating and they were rejected, I don't know how many times with Congress, they said, okay, China's going to, help us out. If you guys don't want to do it, then we'll go with China. So that's basically the leverage that they had.
That was enough to change Congress's mind.
Exactly.
Right.
So Congress changed, especially with that section 177, said this is final. This is the only amount of money you're going to get.
Right.
But then when that issue came, they had more leverage because China was going to come and help them out.
Right.
And so in a nutshell, the U.S. said, okay, we changed our mind. How much money do you need?
Right.
And so now they renegotiated their section, and they were given
additional monies.
Exactly.
So from 1958 to 2004, the U.S. government provided $531 million to the Marshall Islands for nuclear test damages, environmental cleanup and restoration, resettlement, and health and medical programs. The compensation has grown to $600 million as of 2019. Compensation has been provided pursuant to the Compact of Free Association through congressional ex gratia or voluntary compensation payments and through health sector grants during the second RMI Compact Assistance term from 2004 to 2023. Now, the Nuclear Claims Fund was depleted in 2009, and the RMI government claimed that the depletion of the fund left over $2.2 billion in personal injury and property damages awards that were unpaid. The information from the Congressional Research Service says the freely associated states and issues for Congress. In 2023. The U.S. RMI Compact Agreement included $700 million trust fund $700 million trust fund that the RMI government states will be used to address the needs of those affected by the nuclear testing program. And so it's really interesting. You know, we went from, in the initial compact, right, from 150 million to the second compact, which is up to 700 million in a trust fund. I mean, I think it's an amazing thing, right? And I wanted to just kind of
and health benefits.
And health benefits, right.
Very important.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right, is that we're not just talking about, oh, you're going to get this set amount of money, you pull from that money to pay your medical bills. We're talking about this is the money to compensate you, and then we're going to cover your medical bills, which I think, I feel like that is a just and appropriate response. But, you know, when I look at what RMI was able to accomplish, and when I look at where Guam is at today, you know, it's extremely frustrating, because it's not like there's no recognition or there's no compensation given to U.S. citizens. Clearly, there are states that have been the kind of perpetual beneficiaries, right, from the beginning of this RICA discussion till today. There are states that have always been recognized, have always been given compensation. But, you know, it's just a glaring discrepancy to have Guam excluded. And, you know, it's just a totally different approach. You know, it's like Guam has to always play with, you know, a particular set of rules that automatically place us at a disadvantage. And it's just, it's unfair.
You know,
right.
it amazes me how it all started, you know, with PARS, that we had to go to the States and join a group, other downwinders,
right,
and marry in, befriend them,
right,
and get accepted by them, and say, hey, look, you guys are no different than we are,
right,
and work throughout the years, about 16 years together, even up to today, and they agreed. And we felt like we were family. We would go and we lobby their senators, their congressmen and women, you know, Teresa Fernandez, Senator Crapo, Senator Lohan, and Senator Hawley. So we grew together for all these years, and they know that we're no different than they are. But then all of a sudden, politically, they said, oh, you're kind of different, you know, and we're saying, no, we're not. We're dying just the same as your people.
Right.
We're suffering. They need medical care coverage just like you guys. So all of a sudden, we're excluded, but we were included twice.
Right.
If we had been if they passed the bill in the House when Congressman Moylan was there with Mike Johnson, they could have passed the bill.
Right.
We won't even be discussing. They would be discussing something different. We'd be celebrating with all the other states.
Right.
But twice it went before the House, and it never made it to the floor.
Right.
Now that it's going to get passed in this reconciliation bill, we're not there.
Right.
Now we have to worry and hope and pray that, you know, Congressman Moylan works with Congressman Fulcher from Idaho, and the other ones will rally behind us, saying, you know, it's not fair, even though we're in it. We're going to rally for you guys, Guam, you know, people like New Mexico, Missouri, Texas, you know, and all the other states that are in the bill. You know, we're hoping that their congressmen and women will rally behind Guam and say, you know, you and Idaho and Colorado need to be in this also. So that's where we're at today. Is that our political status needs to be better.
It does. It really does. And I think that it's just unfortunate, you know, that year after year, we're over here hoping and praying that our representative in Congress has good lobbying effort, that our representative in Congress is really, really good at making friends.
Right.
Because we're so highly dependent on our delegates' ability to make friends with voting members. I just think that is insulting. I don't understand. You know what I mean? If you're out there in Guam, if you're a proud Samoto, proud Guamanian, you know, you're even especially if you're proud of our affiliation and relationship, partnership with the United States, partnership if you want to call that. If you're one of those that's proud of that, I don't understand how you're not insulted by our extreme dependency on making friends. No, you know, no other senators and congressmen, they also need to make friends, but they make friends in a different way.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Have a vote. If you vote for my bill, I'll vote for your bill.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, it's
even, again, the calculus is very simple on this, guys. It does not take a lot to see the difference between the way that a non-voting delegate operates in the House versus a voting delegate. And then how do we navigate? That's the bigger question. How do we even navigate that with no representation? It's bad enough that we have a non-voting delegate, but to have no representation in the upper house is extremely problematic.
It's insulting.
It is insulting. And I don't understand why more people on Guam are just not completely up in arms about this issue. And so, whatever it is that is your priority, whether you feel like we need, better funding for veterans programs on Guam, or you feel like, we need better access to these types of compensation acts for radiation or war claims, or you think we need a better hospital or a school or whatever, every single one of those issues has a way to tie back into our inferior political status. And no matter what status Guam ends up with in the end, whether we become a state, we become freely associated, we become a sovereign independent nation, every single one of those statuses provides us a framework, a mechanism to be better at achieving the goals that we want for our people in a way that is just impossible as an unincorporated territory. As a possession, we're just never going to have that kind of play. We do have a caller on the line. We're about to end, so we're going to take this one last call. We have, is it Hale or Hale? Hale. We have Hale on the line who wants to chime in on the conversation. Hafide, Hale, you're on the air with us.
Buenas, Hale.
Hafide, Melvin.
Hafide.
Buenas, Chelu. No, Chelu ba, sinon pula sige tomorrow get Melvin. Kogwan in review, committee report ni ane para masogwi Organic Act in 1950 ni at so si Tatanya Bill.
Taza.
And in review, okay, sa tago si Melvin so ma-review sa kondisyon bila tempo na 48, 49 na para mapipapara para monai Samoro Guam ni Organic Act.
Okay.
I-Kongreso binabray, Melvin sila ang comprende pinut Samoro.
Okay.
Si Tatamo Bill binabray ane manigogosyo na para Organic Act, i-problema niya i-Kongreso na binabray na pero manai Organic Act Guam, uno, na kondisyon, dos, na para statehood Guam, segundo, na tres, malago Maricano, Kongreso, na para entalo manamuro sa gizong niya pa pero matsogi galum kelat galum naval and air base. Ay gina pa ako at na ginin Guam is the B2 bomber, right? No officer niya, pudet niya gobernamentong Guam, government of Guam, tada business niya fa bidad niya Anderson and fa bidad niya no Navy. In other words, no, the Congress don't want the local government to have any say or any decision that's being made or decided in the base. That's one condition, and that's why they will never give up Guam because of that, national security requirement. Pula no Chelu, namoli hogo pula no is Melvin. No diskuti committee report ni anyatso si Tatanya Biu no in 1948 and in 1949, and then sa pinseda often a rason na tiu malagwa ya Americano Congreso na pero manai Guam ni self-determination esta manai CNMI Palau and Marshall Islands lo tiu manaya Guam solo independent.
Estas dos masi Hale. We only have a little bit of time to touch on this, but I do think it's important. I think it's important to recognize that because of what Holly mentioned about there is no desire, even like a blatant disregard for what the local government wants. And, our current relationship with the United States in regard to the military is one that's based on consultation, not consent, right? They're only legally required to tell us this is what we're going to do. They don't ever have to ask us our permission, which is by design. And you're absolutely right? The signing of the Organic Act simply acknowledged our right or our deserving of U.S. citizenship. but did not come with any of the rights and privileges or political power that other citizens enjoy. And so even in our, just to kind of bring in the CNMI and our neighbors in Micronesia, as they were, self-determining, trying to elevate their status, the CNMI was able to elevate to a Commonwealth status. So we pursued the same thing. We actually voted on the Guam Commonwealth Draft Act. It was adopted, presented to Congress. Congress refused to elevate it to the floor for a vote. It died in committee because we refused to remove the article on mutual consent and the article on immigration. Now, I think that this is a really important aspect because we were asking simply for the dignity of being able to say yes or no, which was just a deal breaker for the United States. What is the point of having a territory if you can't just impose what you want to do in your military strategy on the people? It's too complex to allow the local government to have a say in any of it. There's way too much bureaucracy in that point. And so, I think that's, you make a valid point. It is to the advantage of the administering power, to the advantage of the U.S. to maintain Guam's political status. It allows them to do what they will with us without interference by the local government.
And that's why it's very important today that we take charge of our plebiscite. We the people of Guam, we take charge,
right?
And we just vote on it.
I agree.
We don't need outside influences. We need to come together as a people, decide what rules and regulation policies that we want to abide by.
I agree.
And if we have to write our own constitution, I don't know if it's that viable. Then we'd write our own constitution.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, that's what self-determination
right.
is all
That's
about.
the key, right? Absolutely. That is at the heart of a self-determination movement, is that it is guided and directed by the people themselves.
Right.
I can't think of a better way to end this show. And so I want to thank you, Mr. Celestial, for being here with us and for all the knowledge and experience that you've shared. I want to thank Holly for getting on the air with us, as well as Joe, who chimed in with us. Thank you, Reese, for holding us down this morning. We are at the top of the hour, and unfortunately, that's our time to go. But thank you to everyone who has tuned in to the show. You are listening to Challenge the Status Quo on Wave 105.1 FM, and we hope to see you next week, Monday, same bat time, same bat channel. Take care, everyone. Adios.
KGUM FM. Daddy No. The talk of Guam is Wave